China protests in Vietnam explode into street violence. Charged through barricades. Riot police showed up in full force. People threw stuff at the police. The police charged at the people and dragged some of them away. Let's just say there were reports of police brutality. A citizen journalist posted this video with the caption, "Protesters are being killed by the Vietnamese Communist government." And at least one kid was so upset by the whole thing that he couldn't hold back his tears. I think he's crying because so many people were shooting vertical video. Hold your phone horizontally, people, horizontally. Now, viral social media moments aside, protests in Vietnam are actually fairly common. It's a communist regime, and that typically means no shortage of reasons for people to get upset. And since Facebook is popular in Vietnam, a lot of people there are organizing protests using Facebook and uploading their vertical videos by the thousands. Anyway, we're talking about these particular protests because they were fueled mainly by anti-China sentiment. The Vietnamese government wants to pass a law creating special economic zones. These are places where foreign companies get special incentives and fewer restrictions to set up factories. Factories the size of small cities. They're worried that the Vietnamese government's special economic zones will be dominated by Chinese companies, giving the Chinese regime too much power and influence. One of these specific things was the idea that Chinese companies could lease land in these zones for up to 99 years. I mean, it's not like that's ever happened before, right? Right. But with anti-China sentiment running high in Vietnam, it didn't take much for violence to erupt. Even though most protesters were peaceful, all it takes is a few bad eggs and a small pile of rocks. People in Vietnam are already angry with China over South China Sea disputes. Vietnam has a long-standing claim that's being aggressively challenged by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese military has built artificial islands on outcrops and then turned these islands into weaponized fortresses. And they spray Vietnamese ships with water cannons when they get too close. This protest banner says, "No leasing land to China even for one day." The Chinese embassy even issued a warning to Chinese citizens in Vietnam to be careful. And in a statement that doesn't at all make it appear that China is interfering in the internal affairs of another country, the embassy blasted the protests for having anti-China content and called them illegal. Well, amazingly, the protests over the weekend seem to have worked. Partly. On Monday, Vietnam's National Assembly agreed to delay their vote on the Special Economic Zone bill. Because why deal with problems today that you can put off into the future? Possibly in a sneaky way that doesn't arouse so much protest. So, problem solved. Except there's more to it than that. There's another element to the protests. They were also calling out a dangerous new cybersecurity bill. As much as the Vietnamese regime hates how the Chinese Communist Party acts in the South China Sea, they love how they do cybersecurity. Vietnam's National Assembly had plans to enact a harsh new law straight out of the Chinese regime's playbook. It would give Vietnamese authorities wide discretion to determine when online expression must be censored as illegal. It would also help them stifle dissent by forcing internet providers to remove offending content, and it would require providers to give user data to authorities without a court order. The US and Canada have both officially urged Vietnam to delay passing this law. Amnesty International warned that this could turn companies into state surveillance agents. And so a lot of protesters were upset about this too. And it turns out they were right to be upset, since on Tuesday, Vietnamese authorities did pass the cybersecurity law, although it doesn't officially go into effect until January 1st, 2019. But in a weird twist, there's also a conspiracy theory that these protests could have been a false flag created by the Vietnamese regime. Specifically, it says that Vietnamese authorities planted people to make sure the anti-China protests turned violent. That way, they'd have an excuse to crack down harder and, more importantly, have an excuse to say, "See, Vietnam needs a new cybersecurity law because you people are using the internet to organize your violent protests. Now that's just a theory so far, and I haven't seen solid evidence, but it's not inconceivable that an oppressive communist regime would be willing to use underhanded tactics to get what it wants. And while it's unclear whether any part of the protests were actually orchestrated by the Vietnamese regime, one thing does seem pretty clear. Now that the cybersecurity law has been passed, this could be one of the last times the public gets to see videos of protests in Vietnam. So what do you think about the protests that rocked Vietnam over the weekend? Leave your comments below. And before you go, it's time for me to answer another question from a China Uncensored fan on Patreon. Forrest Goodman asks, will the corruption in the CCP ever reach a breaking point and collapse, or is the party just too big to fail? That's the million